Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. But what happens when the world stops making sense for our loved ones? How do we make sense of dementia? Dementia affects 1 in 10 Americans over 65, so chances are we all already know or will know someone close to us who suffers this condition. So how do we make sense of this? And by making sense, I don't mean the medical understanding, I mean the spiritual understanding. How do we as Christians make spiritual, theological sense of dementia? And for tackling that topic today, I have a guest that I'm super excited to bring on. It's Professor John Swinton, who is one of the world's leading theologians on the topic of disability in general, and specifically on dementia. He's written a number of books on this, including a somewhat older book written in 2012, but is still, I think, one of the best theological treatments on the subject. It's called Dementia: Living in the Memories of God. I love that subtitle. I would read this book just for the subtitle alone. And Professor Swinton has granted me the right to call him John. So, John, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. It's an honor to have you.
It's great to be here, Curtis. Yeah, it's good.
John, I also discovered, I did not know this, but in the research for this, I discovered that you were formerly the chaplain to the late Queen of England, Elizabeth. And I'm going to just try to kind of like discipline myself not to indulge my fascination with the Queen, birthed in watching all episodes of the Netflix series The Queen, and get you to violate your confidentiality ethics as a chaplain. So I promise you, I'm going to really try really hard not to go down that road.
Well, if you ask too many questions, I'll have to exterminate you. So be careful.
Oh my goodness! It's the old. I think what you just did was the British English, Scottish version of "I'll tell you, but I'll have to kill you." Right?
Exactly. That's the one.
All right. Well, we're here to talk about more serious matters. We're here to talk about how to make spiritual, theological sense of dementia. Yes. And I have long believed that the best theological work, the best theological insights are born out of the lived experience of the theologian. So can you talk about that? How did you end up focusing on dementia as a theological topic? What lived experience is in the back of that?
That's great. So it's a really good question. So my background is in nursing. So I was a mental health nurse for many years, working with people with severe mental health challenges and also with people who live with dementia. And then I worked for a while as a community mental health chaplain. And that was an interesting job because I was working with people who were moving from the institution into community. And of course, the policy was called community care. But of course, you have to have a community that cares before it works. And of course, we discovered that that's not necessarily the case. So my job was to help people coming out of long-term care and to find a spiritual home, somewhere where they could just be in the midst of the difference, accepted, and find a space of belonging. And that wasn't easy because churches are not particularly easy places for people who are perceived to be different. And along the way, I was also a chaplain and with various facilities for people who live with dementia. So all of my formative years in ministry and chaplaincy and nursing was with people who kind of see the world differently. And so when you're with people who see the world differently, you begin to see the world differently yourself. And so something like dementia, at one level, it looks like a biological thing, which it is, neurological condition. But actually, when when that biological body enters into society and lives and loves and relates, then the experience is completely different. And so that's kind of was my beginning point, realizing that experience is different when you listen to people's stories.
Wow. And are you still doing that? Like when you were doing your theological reflection on dementia, how much are you still in contact with actual people who are experiencing dementia?
Well, I'm involved with people in a research capacity now, so I still do a lot of, well, my area, the type of research I like to do in relation to theology is qualitative research. So qualitative research is gathering people's stories, listening to people's experiences. So I still spend a lot of time with people with dementia, and also with people who care for and live with people with dementia. So it's very much on my horizon. Well, see, I'm a practical theologian, so I'm always asking the question, what does it do?
Right.
I believe this theological structure, yes, but it's got to do some good in the world. It's got to bring out kindness and compassion and help us to see how God is in the world. So it's inevitable that I'll end up doing some kind of contextual work. It's just the kind of person I am, the kind of theologian I am.
Well, that's I love that. I'm sure that with you. I also believe in being a practical and public theologian.
Yes.
And it really comes out in your book, this book called Dementia, Living in the Memories of God, because it's scattered throughout it are sort of real life stories of people, and which I think really lend that kind of living quality to the book. Let's start from the beginning, though. And I want to ask you to define dementia, because one of the themes in your book is saying that actually theologians and people who want to think by Christian terms need to be very careful about even defining what dementia is. So can you talk about that? Like what is dementia? How should we define it?
Yeah, well, the beginning point for any journey is important because you begin somewhere, and where you begin and where you think you're going to go determines what you'll find. So it's very important to think about it. So it's a good space to begin. Well, at one level, dementia is a neurological condition. It's to do with some mode of brain damage, either through disease process or through vascular difficulties. Because the thing about dementia is it's not one thing. It's an umbrella term for a number of different modes of brain damage. But effectively, that's what it is. And the brain damage brings about cognitive difficulties, problems of memory, and dislocation, because it's very difficult to know. When you're not sure who you are and where you are, you become dislocated and it becomes difficult. So at one level, that's what dementia is. But when that kind of very obvious biological condition enters into society, it meets with significant problems, because we live in a society that is really driven by the valuing intellect and reason and memory. One of the first things that you'll say to somebody when you meet them for the first time is, what do you do? And then, depending on what they say, you'll put them on a subconscious hierarchy,
Right.
I don't know, from a brain surgeon to whatever it is. It's not a coincidence, but think about a brain surgeon. So if you're in a position where you're losing the very things that society has such a high value of, then that puts you in a really difficult situation to begin with. So before anybody gets to know you as a person, they've already got this assumption about what you should be like because of the presuppositions about what dementia is. And that's how stigma works itself out. So the way I think we should begin are thinking about dementia is it's a meaningful experience that happens to real people who continue to have hopes and dreams and expectations, even in the midst of the difficulties that they encounter. I think that for me would be a good theological space to begin with. People loved by God who try to live well.
I love that as a starting point. These are people loved by God, still having meaningful experiences in the moment, regardless of how their brain continues to process that experience.
That's right.
Those present experiences are still very real. Okay, so if that's our starting point, then where do we go from here? And this is where I think the notion of story as making sense of the world is so critical. Like story is sort of fundamental to how human beings make sense of any experience. So if we start that dementia is this experience that has a biological definition, but it also has a sort of spiritual definition of these are people loved by God, still having meaningful experiences. I want you to describe why we need to keep the theological story in mind, because there's so much impetus to the medical biological story that just says, okay, this is a story of progression of disease, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, loss of function A, B, C, and D, right? That's the story that the medical profession tells. Why is theology necessary to be brought into that picture? What's the different story that theology tells from there?
Well, I think what theology does, amongst other things, it reframes the experience and both gives us a new story and helps us to see that the old story was a mistake or was flawed. So if you think about it this way, how do you make sense of who you are, or any of us, not just you, Curtis? How do we do that? Well, within Western society, what we tend to do is work on accordance to what you might call autobiographical memory. So autobiographical memory is the memory autobiography, obviously, is the story you tell about yourself. Autobiographical memory relates to you being able to bring into the present memories and stories of who you were, and to have that kind of continuity between who you were and who you are, and then project into the future who you'll be in the future. That's somebody asks you who you are, you'll tell a story about who you are and what you've done, etc. Now, that kind of recall memory is what's taken away very often in the latter stages of dementia. And so the way in which society says we should construct ourselves becomes threatened by the fact that you no longer can tell your own story in that way. And that's why people then begin to use language around people with dementia, like he or she is not the person they used to be. Why is that?
Or has disappeared even, right?
Has
disappeared outright, yeah.
That's right. Why is that? Well, it's because they can no longer tell their story in the way that they used to. In other words, it's a cultural thing. It's an assumption that we have within our culture. Not all cultures share the same way of thinking about that. And so when you begin to think about that in terms of scripture, gospel, tradition, you begin to see that actually the cultural way in which we construct ourselves is deeply flawed. Because what the Apostle Paul is very clear about is that we are who we are in Christ. We're not who we are because of what we remember. We are because we are remembered. So it's not our memory that's significant. It's this memory of God that holds us in that place. So to be in Christ means that it's nothing to do with your neurology. It's nothing to do with your ability to do anything. It's simply to do with the grace of God. We are who we are in Christ. And even more interestingly, in Colossians, Paul talks about the idea that somehow our self is hidden in Christ.
Yes.
So even those of us who at this moment in time don't have dementia, we don't really know who we are. We know certain things about ourselves. Very often these certain things that we know about ourselves are mistaken. I'll give you, for example, before I became a Christian, I thought I was a pretty decent kind of fella. And then I become a Christian, I discover I'm a horrible sinner.
You're right.
But that just, my story is ruptured by the revelation of Scripture. And what I thought I knew before then was not the case. So the idea that you are defined by your memory and what you know about yourself, when memory is so fragile and inaccurate, just doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But the idea that you're held because you are in Christ, then that opens up a whole new space, not just for people with dementia, but for all of us.
John, I think you're describing a radically different story that is rooted in the gospel, a story of dementia that's rooted in the gospel. That is a radically different story from not only the medical story we tell, but the Western cultural story we tell. Because let me replay back what I think you've just said, because it is you've just made some very radical statements, I think.
Right.
Because, the Western tradition is rooted in the human self as the subject of almost any meaningful sentence. It's the I that defines who I am. So starting from, Descartes as I think, therefore I am. In dementia, that would be true. Or in the where dementia enters in, it's I remember, therefore I am. And therefore, if I stop remembering, if the I, as the subject of this action, stop remembering, I no longer cease to exist. And that's, I think, what you're saying is the story people are telling when they encounter their father, mother, and that the father, mother no longer remembers. Therefore, they think, they no longer sort of exist. And what you are saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is saying, no, that's the complete wrong way to construct the story of dementia, because in the gospel, the subject that defines identity and being is not the I, it is the God. It is God. It is Yahweh. It is the Lord. And because the Lord remembers, therefore we are. And so it's not rooted in our own cognitive function ability. It is rooted in God's memory. And this is the title, your title of your book, Living in God's Memory. That's a radical reframe, John, that you've used dementia to point out something very fundamental about how the gospel story diverges from the dominant Western story that we've all inherited. Do people register that? Do people get that that's really what you're driving at?
I don't know. Some people do and some people don't. But I mean, you can see the same thing in Paul's imagery of the body of Christ, right? So the body of Christ is not intended to be a metaphor; it's meant to be a statement. But we need the weak, we need the strong, we need the broken, we need the so on and so forth. In other words, our very self. The idea of myself being simply me is challenged by that image, because I can only be who I am as I interact with other people. It's blatantly obvious when you think about it. And during the pandemic, it became obvious to everybody how interconnected we were. It just doesn't look like that. And so one of the things that the reframes that thinking about dementia does is it enables us to see the cultural boundedness of our own perspectives in that sense. Because it was interesting, Curtis, I was, a couple of years ago, I spoke to a conference in Malaysia. It was a group of psychologists, psychiatrists, and various other people, and theologians. And I was talking to them about, the kind of things that we've been talking about, and also about Western individualism and the nature of self. And at the end of they were very polite to me, but at the end of the talk, one of the psychologists says, yes, that's right, for people in the West, he says, she said, but here our sense of personhood is always understood in community. So the idea that you would take somebody out of their community because they had dementia, we were talking about, and place them in a care home is actually, that's the way you lose your personhood. Right. And so the thing that we think is normal culturally in terms of response to dementia is actually, in that context, the very thing that takes away a person's sense of self and sense of personhood.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think this is going to be, I'm sure we have listeners who have loved ones in care facilities. And I would imagine they're listening, thinking, oh my gosh, what does this mean? I will just narrate for myself personally what this conversation is already bringing up for me is I have a friend my age who suffers from an advanced brain degenerative disease such that he, has a very small fraction of his original capacities for memory, for thought, for even speech and so forth. I visit him occasionally. And it's always I always have to overcome so much obstacles for me to go visit him, precisely because of this experience that in this facility and in that experience, I feel like he's unrecognizable to me. And I do slip into that Western narrative of, oh, he's gone or he's disappearing from me. And I think what you're saying is, one, I need to anchor, to make sense of this experience, I need to anchor, no, he has not disappeared because God still remembers him first and foremost. That's the anchor of all of this, is that he's not disappeared because God still remembers him. Even if he's lost his memory, God holds his memories. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that you're just bringing up about how ourselves are held in the memory of others because the body of Christ, because we are corporate beings, we are collective beings, that are defined not just by our own individual memories of ourselves, but really by other people's memories of us as well. I think if I put the pieces together, what you're telling me is when I step into that room in that care facility with my friend, in some sense, I am actually part of his being. Because I remember him, because I am still coming to visit him, because I am talking to him about things that I remember interacting with him about in the past, even if he doesn't, I am participating in his beingness because I am actually remembering him. That it's not just a self-isolated act of self-creation, which he is truly diminished in that ability to do that. But I can, in some way, not fully compensate, but I can I can stand as a sign of God's memory of him and in some real way, I am co-creating his being in some way by the very act of remembering him and remembering him enough to come to visit him, remembering enough him to talk about him, and actually even narrating experiences like we talked about basketball. We talked about a book that I was working on that. I mean, is that the theological story that you're trying to tell here?
No, I mean, there's a couple of things I say there. One, when somebody dies that's close to you, people will use the language, a part of me has gone. And that's true, because we are constructed by our friends or by our family or by our partners. And so, yes, you being there is a mode of solidarity, co-construction, but
not co-creation. That's too much, but it's a bringing into beingness, right? A naming into beingness.
Exactly. But I want to be careful though, and listen to what I just said. There isn't any problem with care homes, and caring for somebody who has dementia is an exhausting thing, and it's not everybody has the resources. So my point is not that put somebody in a care home is a bad thing. My challenge is for care homes to be communities that sustain and remember people well.
Yeah.
And that involves the way that they're structured, that involves the way that they're managed. And it also, you as a visitor is part of that. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think when we're thinking about, there is nothing wrong with putting a loved one into a care home. But the challenge to the care home is this a place that really holds a person in their memory? Is it really holds a person in their identity, even though they don't necessarily remember what their identity is like? So by visiting your friend, just brings that sense of holding into their lives, because you're not there because you want to get something back. You're there because you want to be with them. So you're not going to be saying, "Oh, this is a waste of time because I'm not getting this back. I'm not getting this emotion." You're just there because you love them and you care for them.
Right.
And I think that to me is the beginning point for healing and reconnection, even in the midst of dementia.
John, we've talked a lot about just now about how we do have loved ones sometimes in care homes. There's a challenge that you've articulated for care homes to still organize the experience such that the people living there are still being held in memory, even if they don't have the memory biological capacity that we as the people around them, their caregivers, are holding them in the memory of God. I think that's going to be very challenging. You're talking about a sort of a paradigm shifting change for the care industry. Let's start at, and I think that's an important call that I know you are doing research on, and I love that. Let's step back at the personal level of like the friends and family who are visiting them in the care homes. How do we interact with them such that we are holding them in our memory in a way that actually still names their being and points to the ultimate reality that God knows them, God remembers them, God holds their memory? What does that look like in terms of how we should think about the time we spend with people in dementia?
But the first thing I would say is just always to remember that your presence is a gift. And the reason that you're there is to gift your presence and gift your time to the person before you. I actually think we should think more that way for all of our encounters. But, if you think about, a highly stigmatized person in a situation where they don't really want to be there, they may not be able to articulate how they're feeling at this particular moment in time, but they do recognize someone there who cares and someone who gives them the gift of time and the gift of presence. And that's not a small thing, I think. So I think that's the beginning thing. And the second thing is, and tied in with that is, we have to slow down. We live in an age that's very fast. We're always looking towards the next thing rather than looking at the thing that is in front of us in that sense. And in order to be, particularly when people get to the advanced stages of their journey, in order to be with them in meaningful senses, you need to slow down and take time for those things, as Stanley Hauerwas once put it, for those things that the world considers to be trivial, just small things. Because when you slow down, you begin to notice people. Because one of the, your listeners may well have had this kind of experience where you're with somebody who is very withdrawn for a lot of the their lives. But then suddenly you catch them in a moment, and you know that you connect to that moment, and it's only for a moment very often. But if you're moving too quickly, or if your expectations are unrealistic responses, then you'll miss that. But these little moments of giftedness in the midst of the gifts that you're given, I think, are encouraging. And the third thing is, I think you just always have to give people the benefit of the doubt. People may not be responding, but you really don't know. And the key thing is just to have that sense, the Spirit moves and speaks with groans that nobody understands. So let's give people the benefit of the doubt and give God the benefit of the doubt that he's doing something important in this situation. So just changing our stance and changing our sense of time.
Yeah, I love that, John. I want to ask you, though, about some other barriers that caregivers have to overcome. And again, I'm reflecting my own experience, that if I'm honest with myself, one of the barriers I have to overcome each time in deciding to actually make this trip is my own grief. It is a experience of grief every time I see him, because I am reminded of what I've lost in him as a friend, but also what he's lost. And it's a complicated grief because, when you have the grief of an actual death of somebody, it's finished in the sense of the act of the loss is has happened, right? Yeah. And now you're just grieving the loss. But when you're relating to somebody with dementia like this, it's a complicated grief because it's open-ended. The act of loss has not been completed. The act of loss is ongoing, and you're experiencing and discovering each time you visit them another dimension of loss that has happened. So it's a very complicated form of grieving. Can you give us some guidance on how do we navigate this very complicated grief?
Well, I think you have to own it in a sense that that's an absolute reality, because unlike other conditions, like if you have some kind of traumatic brain disorder, you'll have a change in your life or in the life of the person that you love, but it may well be a stable change, so you can adjust to it. But with dementia, it's a constant movement of changes, and very changes that are not necessarily always positive in that sense. And so you're coping to learn to grieve at one stage, and then you find you've managed to have a mechanism to do that. Then you're into another stage. Mm-hmm. So my sense is, learn how to lament. Be happy to be happy. Be open to just weeping sometimes, and find people that you can give that to, because you can't do that, particularly if you're a carer. You can't do that on your own. And if you're day to day faced with all these difficulties, you can't do that on your own. You need to grieve, you need to weep, and you need to find a space to do that, and you need to find somebody to do that. And at a minimum, I think church communities are full of people who are the friends of Jesus, who claim to be weeping with the world. And so I think we have a tremendous potential resource in the church of people who can absorb some of that and bring a hopeful narrative into a tragic narrative. So own it, lament, but find somebody that will walk with you through that.
John, you saying that makes me remind me of my last visit with my friend, where again, I just have to confess, I was like, it was my wife who was like, it's time we got to go. This is, it's been way overdue. And I was trying to make excuses. I was say, maybe next week. And, but my wife is my better half. Talk about ourselves being corporately constructed. I mean, she really is my better half. And she remembers him in a way that I need to, I rest on her memory of him to activate my deepest, best self. So we went, and of course he's, barely recognizable, unable to really talk much. But what we have found is he's a reader. He was always a reader. He's not a reader now, but he was always a reader. He loved reading my writing, which was always so touching.
Yes.
That he loved, he was always my, greatest cheerleader, like reading like really old, obscure writings that I've done. One of the few people that would do that. And So what we found is that he can get very agitated sometimes during our visits, and then what calms him invariably is when I start reading to him from my books. And the last time we visited him, I read another chapter from my one of my more recent books, The Anxiety Opportunity, that we've done.
Yeah.
You and I have done work in this field.
Yeah.
And I opened up to the chapter where I talk about the resurrection and connecting the resurrection to anxiety, and why, because anxiety is this fear of loss, ultimately we have to anchor our experience of anxiety in resurrection, which means we have to go through loss, because resurrection is about going through death. And so I just started reading it, that chapter. He got very calm and very almost serene, like, as I was describing the resurrection and how it's a bodily. I was very much making the point, it's a bodily resurrection. It is we're not going away to heaven in ethereal souls. We get a new body with new faculties, not just restored faculties, but even glorified faculties. And listeners can tell I'm revisiting the emotions of that experience reading to him. And I was barely able to read because my eyes were just, filled with tears, and I was wiping away snot the way I am right now. But it was for me a profound remembering of the truth of the resurrection. I mean, I was like, he was giving me the gift of memory by listening, and by him being an audience to me, speaking this truth. I felt like he was giving me memory of, like, oh yes, this is the truth of the resurrection. And it emotionally, these are words I've written cognitively, intellectually, and yet he was giving me the gift of deep remembering, of making that a part of, like, my bodily experience. This is, you're already talking about remember me, do this in the memory of me, a bodily sort of sense. And so I've just been struck by, there was an exchange of memory in that exchange, and normally we would think, oh, I am remembering him, I'm giving him the gift, but it was a profound gift of like I said, he was giving me the gift of memory, even if he was not doing that consciously. And it just struck me that I have to believe that happens more often in these kinds of exchanges than we realize, that as caregivers are narrating things, narrating memories, for instance, or narrating truths, as in my case, with people who seemingly have lost the ability to remember, that they are actually giving us the gift of memory of, if not theological truths, important and meaningful experiences we've had with that loved one in the past. Those memories are being refreshed and recalled in our own being as we narrate to them, even if we're not sure what's happening cognitively on their side. Is this making sense? Do you have this kind of experience in your own care?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that because from his perspective, I guess you reading that story, your presence, the sound of your voice, that evokes the memory. One of the things about certain forms of dementia is sometimes the memories are not lost. It's the neural connection between your ability to recall them and that's lost. So you get broken neurons, and sometimes things like music, smells, emotions, sounds like your voice, actually, because the brain's plastic and it's clever, it can reconfigure itself so you can use different pathways. You can access memories in a situation like that. And so, his calmness may be simply because you're soothing him, or it could be just because it brings good memories to him. The problem is, and this is to your credit, I guess, is that all human communication is a matter of mind reading, right? So I have to project into my mind what I think is going on in your mind, and I gauge that by your response or by the shape of your face or the your happiness or sadness or wherever, like, and then I make a judgment about what this situation is like. The problem for people with dementia is that they don't respond in the way that you normally expect people to do. So therefore, people project emptiness onto them. So irrespective of what's really going on, because of the way we communicate, all people can see is nothing. But your persistence, your friendship, your story, and your work, it indicates presence, that you're absolutely there. And it also indicates that you're reading his mind in a positive way, even if you can't read it. You're not withdrawn, you're moving forward. The temptation is always to move back, you're moving forward. And so it's a complex, it's a really complicated situation. Like,
yeah.
Plus, emotions transmit. If you're with somebody who's, you're an expert on anxiety. If you're with somebody who's anxious for any length of time, you'll become anxious yourself. Yeah. And so there's that, and that's the same in that kind of situation. So who knows? Maybe memories do that kind of dynamic work that you're pushing into there.
Wow, really that's a profound thought of that. Again, it just gets to that ourselves are not an isolated being contained in our own faculties, but that other people's emotions interact with my emotions and my emotions interact with their emotions. And so that by being present with this friend, I am transmitting emotions. I'm transmitting like realities that are somehow shaping him, even in unforeseen, mysterious ways. And that's coming back to me in mysterious, unforeseen ways. But in real ways, because it's registering in my body, in my emotions, in my grief, in my crying, in my raised hopes. It's a much more relational definition of personhood than the one in which we are all atomistic individuals, which our beings are completely contained in our heads.
Yeah. But also, I mean, it indicates how devastating the pandemic must have been for people in care homes. To have, faces, and for staff as well, faces covered, bodies covered, no place for connection, no place for exactly the kind of interaction that you're talking about. To be deprived of that for months and months and months, that's not a small thing for elderly people to encounter and for staff to encounter.
Yeah. And John, as we are talking, I am just realizing that in a very surprising way, dementia is a gift for those of us who don't have it, but are encountering them. Because I'm just realizing that how much it actually is an invitation for us to actually remember ourselves more deeply, some core theological truths about our life. So I want to walk through a couple of key theological truths that are important for every Christian to remember, and how an encounter with somebody with dementia is actually an invitation to remember them more deeply, that the person with dementia is actually gifting us with the gift of remembering these theological truths. So I want to start with the Eucharist. So here's why I want to think about this, because the foundational verse is the classic when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Participate in this Eucharist in remembrance of me. Now, how I've always understood that is the act of the Eucharist, the meaning of the Eucharist is thus therefore constructed in my mind, in my own mind, that as I remember all of the events, so I've got to mentally rehearse all of these events of the Eucharist, of Jesus' crucifixion and the Passover. And I am, by my own memory of and rehearsal of the intellectual rehearsal of those events, I am creating the meaning of the Eucharist. It suddenly has struck me that perhaps I should be flipping that completely opposite. That when Jesus says, "Do this in the remembrance of me," he's talking about my memory, not your memory, but the remembrance of me. That's the possessive. That actually Jesus' memory of us is what is actually being enacted in the Passover, and we are we're joining to be part of that. Remembering it's not just an intellectual act, we are becoming participants. We are members of, becoming members of this larger reality, this larger story that Jesus holds, that isn't held in our heads primarily, but is held in his being And our act of Eucharist is we are entering in and reminding ourselves we are held in the memories of Jesus, the memories of God in this act. Help me out theologically. Am I on the right track here in thinking of the Eucharist in this new way because of dementia?
I think you can think of it in that way, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the Eucharist that really does incorporate the whole of human experience. So I think that does open that. But I think also there's another dimension to that, and that relates to what it means to remember Jesus. So when we think about memory, usually we think about recall memory, to be able to bring something to mind in that sense, which is an internal thing. But actually, I think it's something like 95% of what human beings does is non-cognitive. It just happens. And a lot of the memory that we live by is body memory. So as we practice things over time, our bodies begin to take the shape of these things. And, if you've spent any time with elderly people with advanced dementia in worship, you'll see that people will, when you play a hymn or when you engage in the Eucharist, people will come to, wrong way of putting it, come to life is what I was going to say, but that's not what I mean, but come into the room in a very different way. And engage in the Eucharist or engage in singing or engage in prayer. So their bodies take the shape of prayer, or the bodies take the shape of worship. And the bodies ultimately take the shape of the Eucharist. And so you might say, well, why would they take Eucharist when in fact they can't understand what it is? But when you're looking at their bodies in that sense, and remember, Eucharist is a very bodily practice.
That's right.
For years, 70, 80 years, whatever it is, they have practiced this spiritual gift, and now it's become part of their bodies. And now when they engage in it, they maybe don't think about it in the way they are, but their bodies remember Jesus, and they remember them with the wholeness of who they are. And that's important, because if you think about the Genesis account of creation, so God creates Adam out of dust. He blows God's spirit into Adam, and Adam becomes a living human being. Adam doesn't become a living brain. He becomes a living human being. Right?
That's right.
And so the idea that knowing Jesus is simply to do with what we think about Jesus, apart from the rest of our body, is, to me, not particularly biblical.
That's right. We are not brains on a stick. We are whole embodied beings. Right?
Exactly. So remembering Jesus is a bodily action, which maybe shifts in terms of its manifestation as we get older, but not in terms of its intention, because bodily memory is intentional action.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one reframe that dementia gives us as a gift to remember more deeply the true meaning of the Eucharist. Let's talk about salvation, the theology of salvation. And I want to read a quote from your book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. And you're writing about sort of some of the disturbing questions that come up for loved ones as they are relating to somebody who has dementia, who is a Christian. And you said, the deep forgetfulness of dementia and the often profound changes to personality and perceived identity that accompany it raise fundamental theological questions such as, is my mother really saved even though she has forgotten Jesus? Who will she be in heaven if she has so drastically changed in the present? What does it mean to love God when you have forgotten who God is? Speak to those questions, because these are profound questions about the meaning of salvation that people who are caregiving for their loved ones who have dementia, I think, echo somewhere in and disturb their mind and beings. How would you answer those kinds of doubts and questions?
Well, I would trust God. But, salvation is not defined by our cognitive capacities. We can't think our way to heaven, even though sometimes it looks as if it's framed in that way. Because if it was defined in that way, think about it, Curtis. After this interview, you could be standing at the top of your stairs in your house or your office, wherever you are, and tumble down to the bottom. At the top of the stairs, you're a disciple. By the time you get to the bottom, you're not. And you think, well, that would be an odd God that thought that way. Like,
Yeah.
just because you've got some brain damage by the time you get to the bottom of the stairs. And likewise, I don't for a second think that God abandons people. Paul says nothing can separate you from the love of God. He doesn't say nothing can separate you from the love of God apart from dementia or apart from forgetfulness.
That's
so
right.
I think trusting in God, that even in the midst of the changes, God doesn't abandon us. God doesn't leave us. The Spirit remains with us. And as I say, speaks with groans we cannot understand. We cannot understand, but I imagine people who are living with dementia will understand that experience in ways that we perhaps can't articulate.
That's right.
So I think
the anchor of our salvation is not in our thoughts. It's not in our correct thinking. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we can be assured of it. Yeah.
Okay. Last topic, and we'll end here. Resurrection. How does dementia invite the rest of us to remember the promise of the resurrection more fully and more truthfully?
I think one of the beautiful things about the resurrection is, as you said earlier on, it's a bodily thing. And so when Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't say that your body will be replaced. He said it will be transformed. Mm-hmm. And so likewise in the book of Revelation, the new Jerusalem comes down upon the old Jerusalem. It's not replaced, it's transformed. And so for people with dementia, like all of us, the bodily existence we have just now will be different, will be transformed. Yeah. But it's valuable in this moment, because if it's the case that it's not replaced but transformed, then something about our bodily existence just now is really, really important to God. Yeah. Irrespective of the state of our brain at any particular moment in our history, it really matters. And so when we're, thinking about the experience of people with dementia, yes, they will be transformed, but we will all be transformed. That's in right. That sense. And what Paul says, we're citizens of two kingdoms. This kingdom matters just now, and people with dementia experiencing this kingdom matters just now, until the transformation happens.
I think let's really do one final underline of this, because the truth, the resurrection truth, that our bodies are transformed, not just completely replaced, not our past eradicated and a completely discontinuity, new being that has complete discontinuity with the past. That's not the resurrection. The resurrection is transformation, which means there's a through line. There's a continuity from our current bodily experiences with our new bodily. If that is true, John, that would strongly suggest, even promise, that the bodily experiences that people have who currently have dementia, that there's a through line from those experiences to their new transformed bodies, even if their own current memory of it is distorted or compromised in some way because of a fallen body, that all of this is still held in the memory of God. So to bring it down to nuts and bolts, what that would suggest is when that 2 weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, when I was reading to my friend, and that was a profound memory that I now hold within me with my friend of reading him, the promise of the resurrection would say there's a through line between that experience and not only my own resurrected body. I'm going to remember that memory is held by God and will be part of my new resurrected being. I will remember that exchange I had with my friend. But my friend will also remember that God's memory encompasses that whole story. That is held in the memories of God, to use your beautiful subtitle. And all of that is hidden in God, and therefore will be resurrected and raised by God in Christ, such that I can look forward to a day when with resurrected body to resurrected body, I will be able to say to my friend, do you remember that time we had that time where we read that chapter? Is that a true promise, John? Am I following your life?
To be honest with you, there's nothing there I would argue with, Curtis. I do. All of this, but none of us really know what heaven's going to be like.
Of course, it's a mystery, right? Yeah.
But we do get kind of fragments or shards of insight. And
Yes.
I think from these kinds of conversation gives us fragments as shards of insights that help us to see this world better and differently, and look forward to the next world even more fervently than we perhaps been
Well, and
already
if the
doing.
greatest sign and promise, the foretaste of salvation, the firstborn of all creation is Jesus, then our best indicator, our best clues of this mystery of what our resurrected life will be would be in Jesus, would be seeing what in the gospel accounts of the resurrected
Yes.
Jesus and how he related to people. And what is very clear is Jesus having gone through the most deformational experience of a human body in the crucifixion, where you would think his very being and his very memories are being eradicated in this brutal act of crucifixion. His resurrected new body clearly holds the memory of all of it, such that he can go back to Peter and say, you know, very, very clear indication of, do you remember the time you betrayed me 3 times?
That's right.
He and in his own body holds the memory of the crucifixion itself. His body bears the scars, bears the piercings, and he shows it to Thomas to remember, so that he can remember what the whole crucifixion was in a memory that probably Thomas wants to just block out as being so traumatic. Jesus is holding in his body that memory of it and inviting Thomas to enter. So that it would seem to me that when we fix our eyes on Jesus, that is a promise that there is a through line of all of our experiences with each other that is being held by Jesus, even when we go through horrible suffering or our loved ones go through horrible suffering, that we think eradicates all of those experiences. They're not being eradicated. They are being held secure, and they will be resurrected in the final day.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, John, thank you so much. You've opened up so many sort of wonderful vistas of the theological riches that are contained in dementia. Final, what are you working on now? Share with our listeners what you're doing now.
Well, I'm working on a project now looking at dementia care across cultures, because for all the reasons that we've been talking about, when people talk about dementia, there's an assumption that the way that Europeans or stroke the West think about dementia is the only way to think about it, and likewise dementia care. So I'm looking at asking the question under the banner of we take care of our own. What do other cultures, and how do other cultures understand dementia? How do other cultures offer care? And how can we, like all of us together, be challenged, be developed, have a more kind of global understanding of the possibilities for care within a Christian theological context. And so over the next 3 or 4 years, I've got research projects looking at in various places in Panama and Australia, New Zealand, beginning to ask that question. What does it look like when we look at dementia across the world? What can we learn from one another?
Wow, what a wonderful project. We can't wait to be blessed as a church from those emerging insights as this practical theology blesses us all. John, thank you so much for coming on the Good Faith Podcast.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Good to speak to you.
And listeners, please remember to review, rate us on wherever you listen to our podcast. Remember us wherever you are getting your podcasts. And next week, we will once again gather around the campfire.